Welcome to the Sharing the Faith podcast, where every other week we explore the beauty and power of faith in Jesus Christ, the light of the world. Now here is your host, Dr. Tom Neal.
Well, hello, everybody. This is Dr. Tom Neal here with another edition of Sharing the Faith. Thank you so much for joining us. Sharing the Faith is a bi-weekly production of the Diocese of Pensacola-Tallahassee, and each time that we have this podcast, we have an opportunity to have a conversation about the faith or some aspect of our faith that reaches daily life. And today I am very blessed to have a conversation with somebody that I've known now for a good number of years, who is up in St. Paul, Minnesota, where it's nice and warm and balmy this time of year. Dr. Paul Gavrilyuk. Thank you, Dr. Paul. Thank you so much for joining us today.
So glad to join you. Thank you for
Wonderful. What's the temperature up there?
I think it's about 10 today.
10. Okay, well, that's pretty warm.
Yeah, it's not bad.
Not bad at all.
No, we just hibernate. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Well, let me just tell you a little bit about Dr. Paul, whom I have had the privilege of meeting in 2021 when he came to Notre Dame Seminary in New Orleans, where I was working at the time, and gave a lecture on the Pan-Orthodox Council and the ecumenical implications of that between East and West. It was a wonderful time. But Dr. Paul is a Ukrainian-American Orthodox theologian and distinguished holder of the Aquinas Chair in Theology at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. Born in Kyiv, he initially trained in physics at the Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology, where he studied for 5 years, beginning in 1988. He was among the first scholars from the former Soviet Union to come to the United States for graduate theological study, earning his PhD in patristics from Southern Methodist University in 2001. Dr. Gavrilyuk is an internationally respected scholar specializing in historical theology, Greek patristics, philosophy of religion, and modern Russian Orthodox theology. His work is marked by both broad theological vision and close attention to the complexities of Christian thought from antiquity through the modern period. His books, translated into 11 languages, include The Suffering of the Impassible God, published by Oxford University Press in 2004, George Florovsky and the Russian Religious Renaissance, again, Oxford University Press, 2013. He co-edited The Spiritual Senses, Perceiving God in Western Christianity. And on Christian leadership, the letters of George Florovsky and Alexander Schmemann, which was published by St. Vladimir Seminary Press in 2020. He is a co-editor of the Oxford Handbook on Deification, which was just published in 2024, which we'll discuss today, which received Credo Magazine's Book of the Year Award in 2025. Dr. Gavrilyuk is the founding president of the International Orthodox Theological Association, IOTA, a global scholarly society of more than 1,000 Orthodox theologians from over 40 countries. Under his leadership, IOTA has become a significant forum for theological exchange and ecumenical engagement, including recent international conferences dedicated to the legacy of Nicaea and the future of Christian unity. Dr. Gavrilyuk continues to care deeply about the visible unity of Orthodox and Catholic churches. Outside the classroom, he enjoys such things as hiking, grilling, and French Impressionist art. Dr. Paul, such an extraordinarily diverse background that you bring to what you do, which certainly shows in your Renaissance interest in everything. But today we're going to talk about a unique topic, which I know that you're really dedicated to kind of sharing publicly, not just in a scholarly world, but as a public intellectual, on deification, a really fascinating, beautiful concept of salvation in the Christian tradition. So maybe we can begin with some description or definition of what deification is and what it isn't.
Yes, thank you, Tom. Yes, certainly it's the term deification has a certain shock value because the first time people hear it, or divinization, we do not make a particular distinction between those terms, because the first time people hear the term, they think, does this mean becoming God? Do I get to become the fourth person of the Trinity? And then the next question, of course, would be, how much have you been smoking? Thinking about this in those terms. And so I think you're right that from the get-go, it's really significant to make just important qualifications and understand why this term actually makes sense. And I would say that many terms in Christian theology are meant to have a shock value in terms of just upsetting our regular sensibilities. The cross comes as the obvious sort of term and point, right? And not just, of course, as a term, but also as a profound reality of our salvation. So what is deification? Deification, as we define it in the volume, is a process, a goal, by means of which human beings or the church as a whole, or even creation, come to participate in the life of God. And that participation, while, and this is crucial, while remaining distinct ontologically from God. In other words, this is often captured in the tradition as saying that we participate in the life of the Trinity by becoming what God is by nature, we become by grace. Mm-hmm. So if you will, it's a kind of a limit of human striving. Mm-hmm. Now, in Christian theology, human deification is possible because God became human, because God on our behalf became man. And so, again, what's been, and what that means is that since God became man, we can speak with St. Paul and also with the early church fathers, both of the East and of the West, of the idea that God became man so that we could participate in the life of God, so that we could become God's by grace. So principally, as you can see, it's a participatory category, it's an ontological category, and it asks a question, what kind of life we as Christians are striving towards, what kind of life is worth having. And it puts the category of communion with God right at the center of the Christian story of salvation.
And what's particularly fascinating about what you just said, among many things, is that even creation itself, and this is, I think, a view, N.T. Wright often says that the Western conception of heaven is that disembodied souls go to heaven and maybe see God. And there's no sense of the context of the whole creation and man's role within that in terms of this doctrine of deification. So maybe just a little more comment on that particular side that you said.
I think it's a useful. I would describe what you just said as a very useful caricature of the Western thought. And I think we can, of course, both Eastern and Western tradition, and my tradition is especially guilty of that, we can engage in caricatures. I wish, in a sense, my tradition also engaged in a bit more self-searching criticism about these matters. And so, for example, one of the crucial questions is, yes, so to answer your question directly, the extraordinary claim is that the purpose of creation is deification. And while that's the claim, that God effectively has created us human beings for deification. And of course, it's only possible not as a function of human striving, but rather as an expression of divine grace. And notice that once the bar is that high, once you're no longer a disembodied soul trying to get saved by certain things, get saved from the fiery furnace of everlasting hell. Yes. Once one casts the matter as striving to become by grace what God is by nature, then even the question, is it done by human effort or is it primarily a function of divine will and divine grace, should for most people that think about this, even for 5 minutes, more or less disappear. It's clear that the gift of such a kind, that the gift so infinitely surpassing anything that humans can think of course, would be primarily a function of divine action. But then both Orthodox and Catholics quite rightly emphasize the notion of human cooperation. And I think that's not unimportant in understanding, in unpacking deification.
Yes. And that concept of cooperation or synergy between God and human beings, sometimes not caricaturing in an unfair way, I think, but in the kind of popular imagination among Christians can devolve into a moralism, right? That Christian life really is about making sure, of course, that we obey the commandments and avoid disobeying them and committing sins that will land us in hell or offend God. And we can become kind of centered on that, on Christianity as a moral code that has to be carried out appropriately in order to get to heaven. And so this, how does this doctrine enter into that mindset and kind of adjust it appropriately?
So that's a really great question. I think that it's certainly not a doctrine that is meant to be seen as somehow antagonistic to moral categories. The moral categories, after all, are also scriptural categories and even juridical categories. This is something that many of my own, meaning many Orthodox theologians, again, at a popular level, might simply engage in a facile criticism of that. But the juridical categories, namely the categories of the law, are there in Scripture, and one has to obviously grapple with them. One has to do justice to them. So deification provides a broader context for these moral categories. It does not exclude them. It certainly, in many ways, says that the principal categories are those of our communion with God and participation in God. And so even the notion of atonement, for example, that wonderful Middle English word actually literally means at one ment. And so if you think about it in those terms, then suddenly the juridical becomes secondary and the personal categories of communion become primary. And again, for Christians, that's not abstract because this communion is made possible by first God becoming human, by God's assumption of the human nature. And so you have some authors in the tradition, such as Maximus the Confessor, and that's the 7th century Byzantine theologian that is increasingly important for both East and West, who would go so far as to say that, and he would use the following expressions: to the extent that God becomes human, to that very extent also then humans then can become God. Now you might say, one might object to that rather bold claim by saying, no, there's something very unique about the divine incarnation. We're really talking about the second person of the Trinity. We don't become quite that. But the intention of Maximus's claim is to say that the hypostatic union, meaning the union of divine and human natures in Christ, that is the limit also of human striving towards the union with God, so that we ultimately are incorporated into Christ by virtue of being parts of the mystical body of Christ, the church. And through that incorporation, then we also participate in the mystery of the incarnation. So what is it that deification does? Well, it beautifully unites the doctrine of creation with the doctrine of incarnation, and then also with eschatology. So there is a kind of a large arc running from creation to the eschaton, to the transformation of the cosmos, and the kind of divine summation of all things. And then the smaller arc, if you will, is the arc between the fall and redemption. And so kind of creation and eschaton that embrace that smaller arc of the fall and redemption. And so to that extent, again, deification gives you a broader framework for which you can speak about these categories. And I am particularly interested in this doctrine, first of all, because one of the points of our Oxford Handbook is to say that this is not an exotic tradition that's just particular or characteristic of the Christian East, that you find it in the West in all kinds of unsuspected places. You have, for example, people writing comparative monographs on a Byzantine theologian, Gregory Palamas, and also Thomas Aquinas. And so you have now also important articles and monographic works on deification in Aquinas. The more obvious tradition to turn to, of course, would be the Franciscan tradition. and then also vernacular, the so-called vernacular mystics in the West. But crucially, you find also forms of the doctrine of deification in such theologians as Luther, Calvin, the Wesleys. And for the Catholic tradition in the 19th century, especially significant is Matthias Scheben's work on that subject. And these are not just, and the kind of the particular names that I mentioned, it's been now demonstrated by scholarship that their engagement of the topic is not rhapsodic. It's not simply a passing trope, but it's actually a significant theme that they develop.
You know, that ecumenical view that you have, I got my master's degree and worked on my master's thesis between 1996 and 1997. And I did it on Gregory Palamas and his essence energies distinction and what deification meant in him. And almost all the literature, I mean, there were certainly major exceptions to that, were polemical, meaning Western authors severely critiquing Palamas, and then Palamite authors severely critiquing Thomism and kind of versions of St. Thomas Aquinas' approach. But in the last maybe 25 years, there's been an explosion of really fervor for this teaching, even among Protestants as well as Catholics, even evangelicals. Kind of this has become kind of a thing, remarkably so. And I kind of wish I'd done my master's thesis 20 years later so I could have benefited, but I'm grateful I did it when I did, I guess. But why do you think that is? What do you think this kind of explosive interest in deification in the West has become as a way of viewing salvation?
You're absolutely right, Tom. There is an interesting shift. I would still think that there are plenty of Thomists that would not be too enthusiastic about the Palamite distinction because of the way in which, we could get, of course, into more technical details of that, but because of the different ways in which divine simplicity is unpacked. And I want to emphasize that both traditions accept the concept of divine simplicity. It's just how it's understood that is different. And so why would that be? Yes, I can think of specifically on the Protestant side. I think Reformed side, I can think of Hans Boersma's work, especially on participation. And more recently, actually, at a few recent conferences, I think I discovered that Professor Boersma was a more ardent Palamite than even yours truly. And so, so that, by the way, those we don't speak in riddles. And so that your listeners understand what is it that we're talking about. Why is it that this distinction between the uncreated divine essence and the uncreated divine energies? Why is it important in this particular context? Because Palamas's claim is you get to participate in the energies. And that effectively does already make you divine by grace, but you do not get to participate in essence, because what that would have meant is that you become ontologically God, and that you cannot do. And that's an interesting way of solving one important problem, because again, for us, it was also important to be clear to the readers that the ontological distinction between creator and creature, while the doctrine of deification is a doctrine of profound transformation of human nature, nevertheless, that distinction is still upheld. So that was important. And yet, of course, both in the non-Christian forms of mysticism, such as, for example, let's say Neoplatonism and Plotinus, but then also in various Christian forms of mysticism, that barrier is constantly kind of renegotiated. And so I can mention in this regard folks like Meister Eckhart or Marguerite Porete.
Yes.
is often credited with that same idea. And of course, there's even no shortage of people testing that boundary in our time. And I can think of John Milbank and David Bentley Hart. So you could see, both of these distinguished theologians can kind of add their names to the enthusiasts who favor a kind of a monistic approach, if you will, that ultimately it's basically all God. And the volume tries to establish that if you look at the Christian tradition, there are certainly plenty of ways of getting deification wrong. You start with Genesis 3. I mean, Genesis 3 is already an attempt to become like gods, and it's an attempt to become like gods again at the expense of disobedience, at the expense of ultimately preferring something in creation to God and valuing something in creation greater than God. And then you can think, of course, of the Tower of Babel, and then various prophetic warnings in the Old Testament, particularly in Ezekiel, but also in other places against this notion that we are somehow, to rival or become gods by nature. And yet, the Scripture also uses this wonderful and bold language of us being children of God and becoming the sons and daughters of God by adoption. Yes. And so this idea that we are adopted into the family of God is really quite central for the understanding of deification. So much so that recently Archbishop Rowan Williams, of course, retired Archbishop of Canterbury, has argued that this language, this filial language, should be more significant for articulating the doctrine of deification than the claim that there are certain divine attributes, such as impassibility or immutability or immortality, that we participate in. That participation is primarily a function of communion and secondarily a function of this kind of transformation of certain human attributes into something divine. So the language of adoption is really crucial for understanding what deification is all about.
It is. And we talked about this when you were visiting the seminary for your lectures, that so much of, again, caricatures are always problematic, but they're helpful in some ways. The kind of approach to religion that Kant kind of introduced, which is a reduction of religion really to ethics, which is in many ways dominated so much of Christian imagination in the West. It seems to me that this explosion or this growth of interest is really a desire to kind of move beyond that and to reintroduce the sense of mystery, of transcendence, of immanence, and the personalist desire for this, as you said, at one minute, which is a magnificent way of rethinking the overly juridical way of seeing that, very powerful. And I think that the handbook you put together, the Oxford Handbook, kind of brings together these conversations from diverse perspectives. And by the way, would you, do a little show and tell here, first of all?
So what I wanted to emphasize is that, of course, it took a village to put together this handbook. I co-edited it with two wonderful Catholic, prominent Catholic scholars and theologians, Father Andrew Hofer, a Dominican, and Matthew Levering, who are both also dear friends. And one of the important contributions of this handbook is to bring together Eastern and Western authors. And so we have it's over 40 chapters. And so we have a historical part. And within that historical part, we do justice to both sides of the tradition. While some really significant studies of the Latin fathers have already been made, and Professor Ortiz, for example, edited an important volume on the subject. What our volume does, it's the first volume that brings the two together in a kind of in an edition that is really encyclopedic in scope. Of course, you can also taste this volume à la carte. You could sort of take the introduction and then the chapters you're interested in. But we discuss the implications of deification for example, ecological questions. We discuss, and by we, of course, I mean our wonderful authors. And so we again, like I said, we had a a good biblical number of 40, and I think we've surpassed even that number of fullness in terms of the authors of this collection. And so the key point of the volume was to say that deification is no longer simply an exotic Oriental concept, that it is something that could be properly taken on by the Christian tradition in the East and in the West, such that the implication of that is that precisely a shift from juridical categories to personalist categories, from moral categories to categories of communion, and therefore, in that respect, mystical categories. Although I am fond of the idea of, if you will, mundane and daily mysticism, a kind of very, very quiet forms, if you will. Now, I mean, I have absolutely nothing. I mean, I love conspicuous sanctity, of course, and but I also think, I mean, I love obviously expressions of the kind of mystical masters within the tradition are,
of course,
not unimportant. But that said, we really were inviting people to say that, in fact, deification is a path for all Christians. It's actually a part of our baptismal calling. You know, one of the crucial elements, really, of the volume was to say that baptism is initiation into the life with God. It is incorporation into Christ. It is a form of us becoming. It's entering into the family of God such that we become children of God. And so notice that all of these categories simply acquire greater depth because the child is meant to grow.
Yes.
And so you could think therefore of the moment of baptism as the beginning, whether it's infant baptism, whether it happens at a more mature and conscious age. You can think of it as a beginning of the growth that ultimately would culminate in the union with God and the kind of fullness, if you will, of our patrimony, or of our the kind of the fullness of our filial connection with God is what is realized in deification.
So these profound implications, we're touching on such incredibly profound things that have such depth to them. I wish I could spend a whole podcast on each little element of what you're talking about here. But you mentioned at the beginning of this implications part, the ecological vision of the church looking at the world and how we see ecological justice, stewardship of creation. I was reading an article recently about the development of this idea particularly from the Second Vatican Council through Laudato Si, and this understanding of the entirety of creation being part of the work of redemption that Christ has wrought and the work of transformation and transfiguration in the divine life. And then Laudato Si is kind of the implications of that on how ecological justice and care for the environment, our common home, is viewed. But one of the things we discussed when you were again visiting was the how this speaks to the problem of human suffering and its meaning, the depth of its meaning, kind of the paschal character of deification. So, just anything? Is there anything about that in particular you might want to comment on from the handbook, or just in general?
I mean, yes, I think, of course, we often hurt the environment and hurt creation, but then also, as a result, I think the result is that then comes back to us. And so in that regard, by inflicting suffering on creation, we then ultimately also are inflicting suffering on humankind. Where the doctrine of deification takes the ecological consideration is to say that, well, if it's in fact the goal of all creation to participate in God, that effectively creation is not just purely instrumental to our salvation, but is somehow also included in the overall picture of salvation, what would, in light of that extraordinary, bold claim, what would then stewardship look like? What would it mean? And so one of the elements that I emphasized in the Eastern tradition, and we mentioned that early on, because for example, ascetic striving and deification are not opposed to each other. I think there is certainly a And so one way in which that could be stated is that human hubris and human, using a wonderful Augustinian Latin term, libido dominandi, this lust to dominance and lust to power and lust to acquisition and lust to, putting one's names on various things, etc. All of these things are meant to be ascetically controlled within a view that sees the ultimate state of creation as not that of strife and war and struggle and zero-sum game, etc., but rather the ultimate goal is that of harmony and peace and unity. And in many ways, therefore, the opposite represents the world not the way it's supposed to be. And so then one, therefore, solution for that is to precisely be modest and humble in one's, or be aware of the kind of constant desire to acquire, which ultimately really is a desire, that sort of desire and that propulsion of the will never to be satisfied by anything is ultimately a propulsion to be satisfied primarily by God. Again, to use a good Augustinian notion, right? That the ultimate satisfaction of the human heart, what ultimately quells the desire of the human heart is God. And deification, therefore, expresses precisely that impulse. Augustine, by the way, is very fond of the root deificare. He doesn't use deificatio as a noun too often, but the verb is there. And so there have been certainly work on deification, and Augustine, I didn't quite mention that in the beginning when I was listing kind of the number of, a list of Western authorities. That's what actually fascinated me about this project. There was an obvious sense in which deification is an important concept, not a term, by the way. It doesn't show up in Irenaeus. We have to wait for the term theosis to show up. We have to wait until Gregory Nazianzus in the 4th century, which is remarkable. And it's possible, by the way, that happened because early Christians were somewhat reticent to use it in light of the term apotheosis, which meant that a Roman emperor became God simply by virtue of his political credentials or because his immediate entourage told him so. And so notice, so for me, what's also important, surprisingly, you might think, such a beautiful and pious and mystical doctrine, such a woolly concept because you can apply participation in God to just about any account of reconciliation. But actually, I do think that the doctrine has some teeth, some really significant teeth. And one element, for example, is the whole business of the propensity of the rulers, both of the past and of the present, to precisely behave in a godlike or imagine that effectively that they act like gods, especially when they constantly play with the idea that they have the authority over human life, right? So for example, in Putin's invasion in Ukraine, which is unfortunately also religiously justified by the Russian Orthodox Church, you have a very clear sense. I mean, this is a country with the largest land mass on earth. And the largest. I mean, something like, 8 or 9 or more time zones. It's like, yeah. And yet there's this desire to have more or to think that nothing is enough in terms of the kind of boundaries and the borders. So that's, if you will, that's deification gone seriously wrong in the form of this human desire to dominate and human acquisitiveness. So in this regard, again, deification really has important political implications and ecological implications, and that's what we started. Yeah.
That very poignant point Reminds me of Father Tom Hopko, who used to always say that there's no theosis without kenosis. That was kind of a refrain, without self-emptying, without that kind of humbling of the self, which is the imitation of God himself through the virtues. And it seems to me from what you said that so much of deification's teeth resides in the virtues, being the way that we mirror the divine attributes in the image of God in us, in the war of the passions within us against that. And that struggle becomes the bloody teeth of deification as it works out that to the purification of the human being.
I'm so glad you mentioned that wonderful expression of Father Tom Hopko. Indeed, it's interesting, without even frankly knowing that he also used it. This is how my book on the suffering of the impassible God ends. It actually ends on the claim that divine kenosis was the very condition of human theosis. And if that's the case, if God's becoming human and humbling himself is the condition for us to become God, then that also becomes the model for how that's done. And so then there is the cross at the very heart then of human glorification. So however one thinks of glorification, it's sham glorification if it doesn't include the cross. And I think that's an interesting challenge for a contemporary account of the doctrine of deification, because at least traditionally it didn't pay as much attention to the articulation of the meaning of the cross. That was usually the kind of the job of the doctrine of atonement. And so Khaled Anatolius, a wonderful Eastern Catholic theologian from Notre Dame,
yes,
recently wrote the book Deification and the Cross. And so you have, therefore, now an account, a reflection on how one can think of those two as not oil and water, but rather as the two doctrines that require kind of constantly being reflected on together. Because I think it's really significant that in processing what deification is and can become, one also does justice to the inescapable importance. The deification itself is meant to be cruciform. I'm thinking of Fra Beato Angelico's frescoes of Transfiguration in St. Marco in Venice, where the image of Transfiguration is also at the same time has a cross superimposed upon it. And so it certainly is entirely appropriate to image deification in terms of Christ's transfiguration. And that's perhaps a common image, since especially the work of Palamas that connected deification with the transfiguration by specifically divine light, and kind of uncreated light of glory, because of course deification has to do also with our glorification. Nevertheless, like I said, there's something really profound expressed by Fra Beato in the image of transfiguration that already anticipates the cross, that already has the cross superimposed upon it.
Outstanding. Well, there's so much more to unpack, but we're at the end of our time, very unfortunately. But I can't let you go without you telling about your trip to Rome and sharing with our listeners about that experience.
That was such a remarkable and memorable experience, and I just have so many good memories. So what the context? The context was the celebration of the 1700s anniversary of the Council of Nicaea, and of course, in many places, seminaries, universities, churches, etc., we had various forms of doing justice to the fact that the Council of Nicaea that took place in 325 In 2025, we had the 1700th anniversary. And this was particularly the particular focus of the conference that my organization, International Orthodox Theological Association, that you mentioned, or IOTA, that you mentioned in the beginning of this program, and the Angelicum, and that is the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome. So we put together this conference. At first, frankly, we wanted something fairly focused, and the focus was Nicaea and the Church of the Third Millennium. That was the focus, and then the subtitle was Towards Orthodox Catholic Unity. So it was precisely an attempt to think about Nicaea as a foundation of unity, because, of course, that's the Nicene Creed that we all of us say at Mass or at liturgy on a regular basis is truly the foundation of what we Orthodox and Catholics hold together. And as a part of that, we had this wonderful and rare gift, an opportunity to also have a private audience with His Holiness the Pope. And what was absolutely extraordinary about my contacts at the Angelicum, and I have to give it to their own incredible diplomatic skill, as you might recall, so the conference was in June. And around, I think, a month before the conference, unfortunately, Pope Francis passed away. And we had, as you can imagine, we had this audience at first scheduled with Pope Francis. And so I have to give it to the organizing genius of the Roman Catholic Church that in 1 month, it was possible to, well, bury the previous Pope, elect a new one, inaugurate this Pope, and also confirm an existing audience, which none of this. Yeah. So this was amazing. So here we are. So so the Pope, there were about actually over 200 of us because the conference ended up having something like 300 participants. So over 200 of us that were able to come to. So we are in Sala Clementina. And the Pope enters, and the first thing he tells us is that, please forgive me, I'm new to the job, and so I'm a bit late because I was delayed by, if I'm not mistaken, by a president of Argentina that he was seeing before. And so we had the opportunity to greet the Holy Father. He, of course, also greeted the whole conference. He expressed himself. He expressed his hope, which I think is very dear to his heart, for the ultimate, hopefully not eschatological, but earlier visible unity of the Catholic and Orthodox churches. And specifically, we were able to present to him the Oxford Handbook of Deification, and we mentioned this project of the possible joint declaration on deification. Wow. And so he smiled and looked very favorably upon the endeavor. So we are kind of inspired by that fact that we have. And the joint declaration on deification, we think of it as an endeavor that will start with sort of committed Christian theologians and scholars, Catholic, Orthodox, and beyond. And we hope that we would like also to see one of our models, the joint declaration on the doctrine of justification, which was, of course, a landmark document in its time. And the hope here is that the joint declaration on deification would do a few things. It would give an account of salvation that can transcend the divisions of the Reformation, because it's using a different language, and if it's just not getting into the question of precisely the mechanics of justification, although we hope also that there will be a section on justification. And then the joint declaration will also articulate the components of this doctrine that the Church has tacitly held, although it has never been a subject of any ecumenical council. This is one of the interesting surprises.
Interesting.
Yeah, that it underlies, for example, this vision of salvation in many ways is presupposed by the Nicene Creed. but it is not something that is articulated by the Nicene Creed. So that means there is some work for theologians to do. And we also hope that a doctrine that talks about our communion with God, it would stand to reason, and I hope to Christian practice, that would also be a doctrine that would bring us together. Because ultimately, the closer we are to God, the closer then we become to each other as Christians.
Yes, may it be so. Indeed. Thank you for all the work that so many years of work you've put into this kind of not only rigorous scholarship, but as a public intellectual, making sure this is communicated to a larger community of Christians, because ecumenism can't go anywhere if the larger body of Christ isn't informed. So thank you so much for today taking the time to do that, for your scholarship and your work, and especially the work of, is it IOTA or IOTA? How do you pronounce it?
IOTA.
Yeah. So the work of IOTA, which I know has tons of resources available. So where would people look for that to find those resources?
Yes, so please visit, thank you. Please visit us at iota-web.org. So IOTA-web.org. And then also we have, if you search on YouTube, International Orthodox Theological Association, then you will find over 200 educational videos, and some of them also reflecting specifically important ecumenical considerations. And we also have, of course, many recordings from that conference that was explicitly on Orthodox Catholic dialogue and on Orthodox Catholic unity.
Outstanding. And you have your own series on deification that I've used of kind of giving a basic introduction to that. And where's that?
I think it's also under IOTA auspices, because what we did, this was also it was a prequel to the volume, because for me, the books don't just exist as skeletons in the library. They, or in the cupboard, they exist in many ways as these conversations that we're having right now. And so I wanted our authors, and I think in that particular case, I think the selection was because I was interested in the Orthodox authors kind of trying to think together in a more systematic manner, so that the chapters in the volume kind of build on each other and don't, if you will, reinvent the wheel. So I wanted to have that conversation to give the volume greater coherence. So I think it's also under IOTA's. I think it's one of the, if I'm not mistaken, it's one of the, what is it called? Video lists or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, we'll put that under the YouTube there, so people will find that and put that under there so people can access it, because it was I used it back not long after you came and used it for teaching classes, and it was very useful. So again, thank you for making that kind of material.
Very glad. Well, that's the whole reason we do these things. Yeah, wonderful.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm so glad, though.
Such a pleasure having this conversation with you, Dr. Paul. Thank you for giving up time on your morning today to do this with me.
So glad to do it. And God bless, of course, your channel and everything you're doing.
Thank you so much. Well, this has been another edition of Sharing the Faith, which is a production of the Diocese of Pensacola-Tallahassee. Thank you so much for joining us. Please come again in 2 weeks as we continue our conversations about the faith. In the meantime, may God bless you abundantly.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Sharing the Faith podcast. If you would like to learn more about the podcast, visit ptdiocese.org/sharingthefaith. If you listen to the audio version through an app such as Apple Podcast, Spotify, or iHeartRadio, be sure to rate, review, and comment. If you watched on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe or leave a comment on the episode. Thank you for listening.